How to Kill a Spy by Nancy Roberts. Seven Stars Tavern is said to be the champion haunted house of New Jersey. There are houses that have an overwhelming sense of mystery, houses that reach out and capture your imagination by evoking thoughts of the spirits of people who have lived within their walls. For me, there was just such a house. Years ago, when I was a child living in Woodstown, New Jersey, I would pass it on sunny days and rainy days alike. Sometimes I would see it looming darkly beside the road, wrapped in dense fog common to the low-lying area. But whatever the weather, I invariably felt the house's spell. Named Seven Stars Tavern, it was built in 1762 at the intersection of Kings Highway and the Woodstown-Auburn Road. Many stories of the supernatural are connected with Seven Stars, but space here allows for only the most famous one. It is the story of the ghost of a Tory spy. The event upon which it is based is said to be a historical fact. According to the owner, Robert Brooks, a man loyal to the British during the Revolutionary War was supplying information to King George's soldiers. The soldiers would then conduct foraging raids, stealing cows and food from the area farmers. Neighbors eventually found out about the Tories' actions and decided to take care of the scoundrel. A group of men dragged him up to the attic of Seven Stars and tied one end of a rope around his neck and the other around a wooden beam and tossed him out the window. In the 1930s, there was a man living in the Salem area named John Klein. He was one of 4 harvesters employed to cut the grain for the Robbins family who owned Seven Stars Tavern. Nathaniel Natty Robbins always had difficulty getting help locally because the house had a reputation for being haunted. Finally, Natty was fortunate enough to hire John Klein, who had no fear of ghosts, and 3 other itinerant workers named Simon, Sam, and Jim. It was the custom for farmhands to sleep in the large attic of the house, which was furnished only with some chairs, a bowl, and pitcher on top of an old pine washhand, and straw mattresses on the floor. After their first day's work, the 4 men were too tired to notice the musty smell of old wood and moldy straw. All went to bed early that night, and their sleep was deep. On the second day, Simon went about his work with a glum silence that irritated his friends, Jim and Sam. All 4 men worked hard and retired early that night, again from exhaustion. But before extinguishing the lamp, Simon asked if anyone had heard anything strange the night before. His friends at once connected this with his long face that day and assured him that he must have been dreaming. This is what he wanted to believe. But Simon was still uneasy, for he could not rid himself of the certainty that he had not been dreaming. His memory of the event was far too vivid. Simon knew that if he said more, he would be ridiculed. As it was, his friends made jokes about his drinking too much of Natty's cider. The next day, Simon's spirits were still melancholy. He avoided his friends entirely, and just before dark he made some pretext to slip away and climb up into the attic alone. When the others came up, laughing and talking, they found Simon up in the rafters that supported the roof, marking crosses on the timbers with a piece of chalk. They joked about his getting religion so suddenly, but Simon said nothing, and as soon as he had swung himself down, he blew out his candle and turned in. Something awakened Sam during the night, and to his astonishment he saw Simon seated on a chair, staring straight ahead and rigid as a post. At his feet were 2 lighted candles. The agony of fear on Simon's face was real. "What's wrong?" asked Sam, springing to his feet. "Shh," whispered Simon, holding up a hand to quiet him. His face was white and his eyes wide as he gazed in the direction of the stairway. Sam roused the other 2 men as quietly as possible, but perhaps he'd made more noise than what he thought, for Simon repeatedly hissed "shh" at them and motioned agitatedly for them to be quiet. The men could not help being frightened, although they had no idea what had happened. There was a terrifying sense of some imminent peril. In profound silence they sat and waited. Finally, John Klein whispered, "What is it, Simon?" "Shh. Ghosts," Simon whispered back. "I heard 'em again. They have come back here. They're downstairs." Klein was not afraid of ghosts, but Simon had shaken his confidence. It was not what Simon had said, or even the conviction with which he had said it, that upset Klein as much as the fact that now and then Simon would whisper a few stuttering words and give a startled jump. The story, as Klein was able to put it together, was that Simon had actually heard ghosts that night when the men said he had only been dreaming. At first, Simon said the ghosts were far away. Then they came nearer, and finally there had been a terrible scuffle on the stairway with much shouting and swearing. A group of brawling spirits had come thronging up the ladder into the attic and headed for the window near Simon's mattress. They pushed and shoved right up to my window and went out through it as if they were smoke. Twice now I've seen them and heard them. "How do you know they're ghosts?" asked John Klein. "If they were human, they would all be dead. That window is 60 feet above the ground, but they're not dead. I heard them clatter back in again. Shh. They're downstairs right now." All was darkness except for the shadows of the men moving as the candles flickered. Simon made them lock the door at the front of the stairway. Klein and Sam did so. Next, Simon ordered that all in the attic windows were to be closed and wedged, too, and that they did also. In silence they sat and waited, hearing only the beating of their own hearts. Simon would not let them set their chairs over any cracks in the floor because, as he told them, when the ghosts find the door barred, they'll come up through the cracks in the floor. Not a sound. They were all apprehensive, yet there was nothing but a prolonged stillness. After some time had passed, Jim broke the silence and told the others they were all blank fools and that he was going to go back to bed, and the rest followed sheepishly. How long had they been asleep is uncertain, but they were brought to their feet by the most hellish screams of terror. Simon was nowhere to be seen. By the light of the candle that someone lit, they found him almost hidden down in the angle where the floor met the sloping of the roof, his face to the corner, his hands clasping his head. He was screaming and sobbing, praying and writhing, all the while kicking as if to get away from somebody or something. Simon's screams brought up Natty Robbins and the woman of the house. It was the woman, more than the man, who finally succeeded in calming Simon down. This is the account that he gave of what had happened after the 4 men had gone back to bed. I was sound asleep. I didn't hear any noise at all, but before God, when I woke up quick, I felt something. I tried not to do it, but I couldn't help pulling the sheets back and peeking out. There was nothing I could see because the candles had been blown out and there wasn't a bit of light, but I knew there was danger. Suddenly I heard a steady thump, thump, thump on the stairs, as if someone was striking with a light hammer. My eyes were riveted in that direction. It was the pitch black of night, but just as plain as if he'd been made of moonlight, I saw a man slowly coming up the stairs. First appeared his head, then his body, and finally his whole figure. He held the end of a heavy rope in his 2 hands. At each step, he hit the step ahead of him with the rope. Although he wore heavy boots, there was never a sound from them, only the thump, thump, thump of the rope and a bubbling sound in his throat, as if he were trying to say something and couldn't. After reaching the top of the stairs, he advanced straight toward the window by my bed. I thought that if I kept still, and he didn't see me, he'd go on past me out the window, as he had done on the previous night. Then I'd be well shut of him. But just before he got to my bed, he commenced a violent grabbing and tugging at his throat with his 2 hands. All the time he was making the most horrible choking noises and twisting his body and striking out with his boots in a way that I thought would be the end of me. Then all of a sudden he quieted. He threw out his arms and raised his head as if praying, all the while moving toward the window. I had a sense enough to know that he would soon be gone, and I felt easier. But when he was right opposite me, I could see there was a rope tied tight around his neck and hanging down behind. God, how I remembered the sound of that trailing rope, for I had heard it before, not knowing what it was. My trouble had only begun, for instead of going on past me as I prayed he would, he suddenly halted, dropped his arms, and stood looking down at me. I tried to call the boys, but was too terrified to make a sound. Kneeling down, the ghost threw back his head and thrust his neck with the rope around it close before my face. I couldn't stir. He pointed to his throat, out of which were coming those ghastly, gurgling noises, and he repeated those violent motions I had seen before. Now I saw they were efforts to untie the rope. His face and neck were blue and swollen, and a bloody froth oozed from his lips. He reached out and took my hands in his, and raising them to his throat, I somehow found the strength to pull them back. He gently took them again, and something made me understand that he wanted me to loosen the knot. Somehow I did it. I don't know how. He leapt up, uttering the most devilish "ha ha ha!" and disappeared through the window. And that is the last I remember until daybreak. Simon, Jim, and Sam left the tavern the next day. John Klein worked a day or two longer, then he too left. Not that he was afraid of ghosts, he said, but because he couldn't get Simon's screams out of his ears. As he was finished telling the story to his son, Klein shook his head and said, "What's the use of working all day at a place where you can't get any sleep at night?" The Tory spy was never seen again at the Seven Stars, and Klein swore that Simon's cries had scared him off, but others believed that Simon laid the ghost to rest when he was brave enough to untie the knot and free him. Said to be the best preserved colonial tavern in the East, Seven Stars was built in 1762 by Peter and Elizabeth Lauterbach. For more than a decade, the tavern was the home of Roy Plunkett, the inventor of Teflon. Though it is not open to the public, passers-by may view it from the road at the intersection of Kings Highway and Woodstown Auburn Road. The end.